Hi, I'm Steve Carlson, major party nominee for U.S. Senate from Minnesota, with a foreign policy edition of Debate This. That's directed at Al Franken and Mike McFadden. Today, I want to address foreign policy, to show the solutions that are there if we have some leadership. Unfortunately, our leadership is not in control, and foreign policy issues in the region of the Middle East are becoming event-driven. So we're reacting rather than leading, as Americans now rank foreign policy as a leading issue in this 2014 Senate race. I need to address the situation in the Middle East. Of the three major party candidates for U.S. Senate, I have far more international experience and understanding than either Al Franken or Mike McFadden. And I would say probably more than Kevin Terrell, whom I defeated in the primary as well. But this ain't SNL, and it ain't Wall Street. The Democrat and Republican candidate for Senate together have zero experience or understanding, and their two-dimensional, dangerous so-called solutions on such issues actually create risk of further attacks on our homeland, and even World War III overseas. Nor have the Democrats succeeded in showing their so-called foreign policy credentials, because their lack of leadership has stirred up the most dangerous and risky situation our world has faced for some time, probably since Vietnam. If we're the superpower, if we're the leaders of the free world, we need to act intelligently, not politically, to steer that world to the calm, deep waters and away from the rocks. The so-called responses of Obama and those supported by Franken and McFadden are foolish. They do nothing but make things worse, and in my opinion, make future 9/11s almost certain. And in fact, they pose a direct threat to Minneapolis and Minnesota. We must reverse this course and stop buildup of the threat of ISIS. And there is just one solution, and Franken is not doing it, and Obama is not doing it. We must declare war, effective war on ISIS right now. Not wait until after the election. A war with a defined mission of dismantling the new state and its army, and bring Britain and other powers with us. But don't wait for friends in the region to fix it for us. We must close down the ISIS state and capture and remove its residents and leaders. I'm not advocating obliterating anybody, but air power should be directed at destroying the enemy or his will to fight. Degrade and destroy is double talk. The situation right now, and it is changing as Obama and the Democrats and Republicans dither and dally, but the situation now is still much more like a conventional war with a conventional objective. If Obama had the will, it would be nearly completed by now. So Congress must give him that will, give him that directive, but don't expect his military people handpicked to carry out social engineering in the military rather than defend America to tell you how to do it. I think that if we successfully shut down this ISIS state and force them to surrender, what we should do is work out a status of forces agreement in Iraq that reincorporates many of the people now excluded and who are joining with the new state back into Iraq. These people are now joining towards ISIS after Saddam Hussein. And so after we defeat that state, we must work to incorporate them back into Iraq. We must get a SOFA, a Status of Forces Agreement, that defines a peacekeeping role for some U.S. forces with a defined purpose. So defined war, limited war, and defined SOFA, limited commitment. It can, and I believe must be done. And we should try to get the support and involvement of a coalition of world military powers, including Russia. This is a time, like after 9/11, when Bush had the opportunity to lead, that Obama has the opportunity to lead. And he's not leading. Not only are there no troops, boots on the ground to carry out the limited mission I've outlined, there is no mission. Mindlessly dropping airstrikes to target bad guys, or to dare them to launch an attack and then try to stop it with airstrikes, does not qualify as a mission, nor does it qualify as leadership. Instead, what we see is that Obama has pulled out the U.S. forces for his own political ambition, and he has simply shifted the chaos and mayhem from Iraq into Syria. And the so-called solutions, glibly backed by Franken and McFadden, just lengthen the time of inaction and fooling around with politics and elections as the threat of terrorism and the threat to the region just grows. And it's pretty clear that's what the administration actually wants. They want the threat to veer toward Damascus. And if that happens, in today's volatile world, we might get our apocalypse. Instead of removing the ISIS state and its army, what is happening is we see the massive outflow of the original inhabitants, leaving the land to its new rulers and masters, whom Obama let stand. Now they're calling for women and children. It's a clear statement to this Islamic state from Barack Obama, play nice and I'll let you stay. Not degrade and destroy. We have no plan to do that, and Obama and the Congress know it. And Franken stands there with his hands in his pockets. And McFadden states his demands and takes cheap shots at Franken, but obviously is unwilling to do anything about the situation. McFadden's deathly afraid to be associated with boots on the ground. And I don't call that progressive, I call that reckless and inexperienced. This action I've outlined should have been done quickly when the threat appeared, just as action should have been taken in Benghazi when the terrorist attack occurred there. ISIS is another Benghazi, a result of aimless Obama and Clinton policies and a Congress who are sitting and watching all this and doing nothing because they are more concerned about the next election than about America's safety. And it has been openly stated that this solution Franken voted for and McFadden supports is just a partial solution and depends on the new Congress taking it up again right after the election. A little bit like Obamacare. Is that what you want? But the way McFadden and Franken talk, they're through with it. It's done, and now they're carping at each other over ridiculous, inadequate, and unrealistic responses. It's highly likely that the lame duck Democratic Congress are going to have to act again because this situation can't wait until after January when the new Congress meets. And what a way to start off the new Congress. So let's look at what Franken and McFadden have done or are thinking of doing. Among them are airstrikes, arming so-called Syrian moderates, and going after the Minneapolis immigrant community. They support a combination of airstrikes inside Iraq and Syria, giving arms to so-called moderate Syrians, which they will use to try to topple Assad. And that's not part of the formal plan, but it is with a wink and a nod. And toppling Assad will make it look like Hillary Clinton was right all along, and you should vote for her in 2016. The list also includes bringing the fight against terrorism to Minneapolis. Nice going, Al. These proposed actions and inaction are not going to end the threat. It's just going to feed the cycle of retaliation in the Middle East, in Europe, and in the United States. And it's going to bring the Somalian conflict deeper into Minnesota instead of into Somalia, because there is trouble in Somalia. It's a troubled state. Allowing Eric Holder, who has resigned but is continuing his duties, into Minnesota to train health and social workers to spot trouble, to prevent recruits, is just going to exacerbate the conflict between the various tribes who have been warring since a superpower conflict in North Africa toppled a fragile national government. This type of federal intervention into Minneapolis, as invited by the big party candidates, is going to result in civil rights violations that will spread to the non-immigrant population, setting new domestic practices. I suppose if you're in a phone call with one of the targeted Somalis, that NSA can listen to all of your calls from then on. And it will pit tribe against tribe, as the U.S. takes sides between leaders and communities. Actually, it's a non sequitur that there is terrorism between Iraq and Syria because of the failed leadership of the Democrat administration, and so the nation should militarize Minneapolis. It is better that Minnesotans get involved than giving jurisdiction and control to the federal government. This should have been done before. Somalians are politically active. Their presidential candidates have been here before. What we need to do is work with them, not for political motivation, but to help train them for democracy, for human rights and tolerance. Human rights, democracy, and tolerance are the total opposite of what we see emerging in Africa, where under Obama, the war on terrorism has spread to Africa, and now Minneapolis. Al Franken does not get this, but his federalization of the issue is exactly the wrong thing to do. We've seen the military helicopters buzzing overhead here, and it should raise concern. Al should address that. Why are we having the military operations here? Why the expanded NSA surveillance around the nation? The threats to continuing access to the internet? Leadership? We need it, and we don't have it. And Obama, and now Al Franken and Mike McFadden, have allowed a new country to be formed and given land and authority in between Syria and Iraq. The state is the size of Indiana, which is called ISIS. It's inconvenient for Obama to be calling it a state, so he pretends it's a word game, and our inexperienced reporters play along. But now is the time, when Obama has erected a new Islamic nation, instead of bringing a proper conclusion to the war started by Bush in Iraq and Afghanistan, now is the time for Mike McFadden to be using the word, "it's unacceptable," and pounding his fist on the lectern. But he's not. And Al Franken's only response has been to basically bring the war to Minneapolis. He found out that some immigrants got involved with al-Shabaab and the ISIL. Immigrants from Minneapolis, where he lives. And so now he wants Eric Holder to use grand juries and also social and mental health workers, probably teachers, to root out recruitment. It's not a good way to create jobs for Somali Democrats, government jobs tied into the federal government. And Mike says, oh yeah, he should have done this before. What this shows is two totally clueless big party Senate candidates preening and posturing as if they were leaders of the free world defending our nation. Well, we all know they're not. Basically, the issue called ISIS is really now to fight the terrorism against the United States that is growing as a result of Obama's and the Democrats' action to follow through with Obama's politically designed and politically motivated pullout from Iraq and Afghanistan. Here's what happened. Unfortunately, while the administration was on the one hand pulling out of these conflicts, Hillary Clinton was ramping up violence in Syria by bringing the Arab Spring to Syria and trying to topple Assad for no reason, which resulted in violence and sectarian warfare. Clinton's policy is senseless and reckless, just as it was in Egypt, Libya, and basically throughout the world. It did not lift up women, and war will never and can never lift up women. Any politician who tells you it can is hypocritical and basically has no foreign policy. So because of the Syrian chaos and mass killing brought about by Hillary and her bringing the Arab Spring to Syria, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups were attracted to Syria. Then when Obama failed to get an actual end to hostilities in Iraq because his only goal was to get out in time for his election purposes, Saddam Hussein's men organized ISIS. Basically, ISIS is a continuation of the unfinished Iraq War, and their unforgivable beheadings are directly aimed at the United States and some other European countries. Some Americans may look at this and see just a few unlucky individuals, but this is a clear attack and threat of retaliation for our foreign policy and national security. To allow this to happen is to abandon our own safety and security. In responding to the continuing terrorism of murder of journalists and aid workers as well as Christians, Obama did not lead. Obama made the deeply offensive comment that Americans are biased when we protest the slaughter and torture by these Muslim extremists of Christians in the Middle East. He said, we ignore the suffering of the Muslims. But we do not ignore that suffering, Mr. Obama. That is why we sent our soldiers there, to help all the Iraqis, to stop the horrific actions of Saddam Hussein against his own people. It began in 1993, and it's still going on, and we probably should have handled it a lot better. But when Christians are being attacked, is not the time for Obama to be accusing Americans of being anti-Muslim. Of course, Muslim people have aspirations of a good life, with peace and dignity, just as non-Muslims do, certainly as Christians do. But you, President Obama, have failed to stop the formation of this Saddam Hussein new state, ISIS, and that is not due to any American callousness to the suffering of Muslims. Furthermore, Obama used as a pretext for this awful pullout the supposed shortcomings of al-Maliki, and this allowed him to blame George Bush for it, because al-Maliki was backed by the Bush administration. You see, everything is reduced to politics here. Who gets elected? Who's running? Who needs an election? And then the politicians, including Al and Mike, decide what solutions they're going to back. We must abandon the misguided, politically motivated pussyfooting around and get down to business and defend our country with the right leadership. I'm Steve Carlson, and I approve this message.